Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show where we talk about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about Scott Pilgrim Takes Off Season 1, Episode 7. Great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. Well, first and foremost, we have Scott kind of falling through this time stream. I love we're seeing, like, the past. We see, like, some indigenous huts, we see dinosaurs. I'm surprised, jumping ahead a little bit, like, I'm surprised old Scott, as we're referring to future Scott as, I'm surprised he didn't, like, worry about that more, because I'm like, are you not worried? Maybe it's very linear, the time travel, like, maybe it's almost, because it's like running through the Speed Force where you get to see everything going past, but if you veer off in the wrong direction, you don't go where you're supposed to go, but maybe there's no concern for that, because, like, Scott gets pushed out of the time stream, but then he, like, comes back in to attack, like, his older self, so that's like, oh, like, the fact is that old Scott was just not worried about it, like, you're not worried he's going to just end up in some random time. I also love the depiction art-wise, how they handled that, where, like, Scott's, like, head got knocked back and his head went into the time stream or whatever, like, because everything's around him and he's just out in the middle, but once you actually touch it yourself, like, how they depicted that animation-wise, where, like, his head started leaking like ink. It started, like, blobbing out like ink. I was like, oh, I love that. And then he just disappeared and just reformed and just attacked from the top. So I was like, that's interesting. But yeah, Scott finds himself 14 years into the future and meets older version of himself. I kept being like, that voice. I was like, I wonder who's voicing old Scott. It's Will Forte. I'm like, that makes so much sense. I'm about to say, it didn't sound like it was Michael Cera doing a different voice. It sounded like it was, which I haven't commented on it. It is wild. Like, it almost, if I would never have guessed that was Michael Cera, like, doing, like, Scott's voice. I wouldn't have thought that, but I haven't talked about that the entire time. Scott hasn't been in the show much, but still. So he's in the future, and I think it's so interesting that, like, the moment Scott's, I know, because Scott's like, oh yeah, I've been through this and that, and he's like, oh, because regular Scott, present day Scott being like, oh my god, like, your beard, he's like, thank you for noticing, like, no one else comments on, like, the beard, because, like, it's like, oh my, because Scott's like, oh my god, we live past 25, he's like, yeah, and if we're lucky, we might even live past 40, it's like, man, we've been through some cool fights, he's like, oh, we did okay for ourselves, so that was interesting. But what really shocked me was, like, when they got to quote unquote Scott's house, I was like, why is it this place is in great condition? The rest of the city looks like it's in shambles. It looks like shit. I'm like, that's interesting. It looks like his place looks immaculate, but I'm like, why does everywhere else look like that? Even, like, once again, the video game stuff of just, like, right, he opens a door at one point to get to the VR headset. I love that it's, like, him putting in, like, a code, because essentially it's like a Game Boy or whatever, a classic Game Boy with, like, the D-pad being what it is, and he put in, like, a code, and I was like, I wonder, is that code he put in something significant? Because, once again, I've never played it, but I've seen someone play the beat 'em up, the Scott Pilgrim side-scrolling beat 'em up. I wonder, is that actually what he put in, an actual code for that game? Because I think that'd be so interesting if that's legitimately that. But either way, I'm probably overthinking. But I love, like, there's just so much, like, video game, iconography is not the right, I mean, maybe it is, but I don't think that'd be the right word. Like, there's just a lot of video game aesthetic, like, specifically controllers, because, like, where the VR, like, at one point, there's, like, an outward view, and, like, there's this little area that, like, the outlining of the area is shaped like a video game controller. It's just little stuff like that I think is so interesting. Well, it also ties in, and it makes sense why all that's the way it is, because we find out from Wallace, which I love that his hair is white. I was like, well, Wallace is, like, 30-something. It's like, he shouldn't be that old, because he's, like, what? 39, I think, because yeah, he's like 2 years older than Scott. So I was like, why is your hair white? But I mean, some people kind of hit that white hair sooner than others, but I think it's just a stylistic choice. But he's married, and I guess, like, I mean, because Wallace has been playing kind of like the bachelor's life up to this point. We don't know how long he's been married, but his husband works at Nintendo, and it's like, oh, do you get all the free games? And Scott's like, yes, and Wallace is like, no, it doesn't work like that. It's like, yes, it does exactly work like that. So we found out about Scott and Ramona too. Like, once again, their story plays out the way that, once again, the comic traditionally plays out in the movie. Because I actually looked it up because I was curious. Luckily, I didn't spoil anything for myself. But the question was, like, what is this series supposed to be? And it's supposed to be like a remix retelling of the comic book story, which the movie did that too. Once again, so it's an extra remix and stuff like that, which I think is so fascinating. Because like I said, the movie kind of remixed and changed things on its own, and so it's this comic. Because it's almost being like, yeah, what you know it's a comic. I mean, it's this series is kind of an even more remix, because it's like, hey, what you know it's a comic is canonical, but that's what happened in this future, and Scott and Ramona didn't have a happily ever after. In fact, they got not even divorced. They're separated currently. They're not even officially divorced. The way he was like, oh, 13, 14, like, I don't know if he was implying like they've been separated for these 14 years. So almost implying like they'd only been like that little bit they were together before they got married. Like, and some of their marriage, that's all there is. Or is it implying like, no, it's actually fairly recently that we got separated? I don't know. But and because he'd even ask Wallace, it's like, how bad was the breakup? And Wallace is like, you remember how you felt when you and Envy broke up? It's like, yeah, it's like that, but 10 times worse. It's like, wow. I mean, and it becomes, because, I mean, I love, because it's that philosophical question. Is it better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all? You know? And I truly believe it is, for the most part. I mean, once again, I feel like it is a case-by-case basis, but I want to say generally, like, because every relationship you've ever been in, like, it helps you grow. You learn from it. You grow as a person, hopefully. Like, that's something you and your significant other, like, you might not be able to grow together, but maybe the experience did help you grow as a person in many different ways. That's at least, you know, I had that perspective as a teenager, or when I was younger, in my early 20s, being like, you know what, fuck that. Like, all the heartache, I wouldn't want it. But now I'm older, I'm like, no, I appreciate any love or heartbreak I've been through in my life, because I don't know, like, it gives me perspective. You know, it's that thing of kind of like scar tissue. You know, it's like, right, you're not to make it seem like, oh, love is a battlefield and you get scarred, but it's like, no, everything you go through, the physical and emotional scars or whatever they may be, they are part of your story. They are a part of you, and you are an amalgamation of all your experiences, right? So it's just, that's kind of my perspective on it. And I think that's such an interesting thing, because like young Scott is like, right, like he just met Ramona, like he's super in love with her, versus old Scott, who's like, yo, like I've been through the heartbreak and I kind of don't want to go through that again. Trying to be like, you act like all this is about Ramona, even though, yes, in fact, yes, okay, it is all about her. Because he wants to go back. He's like, the worst mistake I ever made was fighting all the exes. Not because I lost, because I won, and we were happy, everything was great. And then, like, she trampled all over my heart. She rollerbladed all over my heart, and I don't want to go through that pain again. So just don't fight the exes. So he tried to change history. So once again, it's, like I said, it's just that complicated thing. This all started, he's even saying like it's Wallace's fault, because Wallace is like, oh, I bet you want to go back and you should go back in time and make it so that you and Ramona never got together. And Wallace is like, dude, I was joking. He's like, well, you tell me that now, because no one actually expected you to go back in time, like build a time machine and go back in time. But it's like, how'd you build it? It's like, well, now it makes sense. Okay, so the twins are responsible, because he's in a new band with the twins, which does beg the question, because we didn't get to spend a lot of time in the future, so we have no, I mean, we saw like a lot of the crew is there in the future, but we don't know whatever happened to Sex Bomb, like, you know, just everyone kind of went their ways. I love that. I also love this little detail. They haven't mentioned it the entire show, and this is something I only recently found out about the Scott Pilgrim world, is that when you die, you're not permadead. You go back to your respawn point, which is your house. So it's very like Minecraft in that regard. Like, yeah, where's the last place you slept? It's your house. But it's interesting because there's actually a webtoon manhwa I've read called, was it Reawakened Man? That has that same premise. Like, it's not even a spoiler because it's just the premise behind it. Whenever this guy dies, 3 days later, he respawns in his room. Like, it's an interesting concept and how that gets utilized for the story. Both good and horrendous ways that gets utilized is really like heartbreaking and sad. But either way, it kind of reminded me of that, which I thought was interesting. So I was like, oh, because so like anyone we've seen die in the show turn to coins, which I guess includes some of those God, what was their faces? Like the director from the Scott Pilgrim movie, or even some of those paparazzi, they all ended up back at their houses, I guess, in that regard. That's just how things work in this universe. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting detail, because it's like, because Scott was like, whoa, didn't we beat those twins? You said we beat them, so how are you, like, on good terms with them starting a band? He's like, oh yeah, like, yeah, you respawned at their house. And I wonder, is that something Scott just hasn't, like, he's probably beaten people up, but he's probably never killed anyone. So maybe that's why he doesn't know that shtick about, like, oh, that's kind of new information he's finding out about this world, or what? I mean, or maybe it could be just anyone he's ever defeated did turn to coins, but he never ran into them again. So he's just like, oh, they're dead, and just went most of his life never knowing there's a respawn situation in this world. He even had the interesting line where it's like, oh yeah, like, bad guys make great good guys or whatever, which makes me think of it, I will always think of a leverage with that. Bad guys make the best good guys, type of line. So it's like, yeah, like, it's something you'll learn more and more on your adventures and stuff. Because Scott got a little look at some of the future, but he also, which is even sadder too, when you have like old Scott's, like, it says it says good memories, but good is scratched out, so it just says memories. And that was like all that stuff. I even love that it was like, oh, this next part is stylized in something else. It's like, oh, like, no, it's just art. He's like, nah, man, whoever did this part was bad at art. I was like, that's such a dick thing. That feels like that might not have just been like an inside joke for the show. It felt like that might have been like an inside joke or like reference to something else as well. I don't know. But we catch up with Ramona. Ramona, like, her hair is even longer, still doing the colored hair thing, still delivering stuff. But she comes home to Wallace and young Scott there, and it turns out Ramona's the one who wrote the young Neil, the script that young Neil was using for the movie. So I was like, interesting, because she found out about what Scott was going to do. So she wanted there to be some reminder, because once again, we don't know how this whole time travel thing works. Obviously, it's going to be a thing of, well, once time plays out different, either it's kind of like, hey, that end result's still going to be the same, we're going to get there eventually, or it's just going to be like this timeline, because the alternate timeline thing it varies from like who's ever writing it. Sometimes it's like, hey, that timeline disappears, and like, okay, so to say like there's this future is timeline A. This is how things originally play out. And obviously Scott was aiming for a timeline B. Well, typically some stuff will make it so timeline A no longer exists and only timeline B does. But there are other things that'll go like, oh no, timeline A continues to exist, but it just happens to be the timeline B is a parallel. And if you go to the future, you'll always go to the future of timeline B. You can never access the future of timeline A. Timeline A will always be able to access timeline A's past to some extent, which you could still go back and create a timeline C, and so it's a whole thing, right? Once again, I love me some time travel, so I'm all about that. But basically, it was based on a memoir written by young Neil, or old young Neil, because it's like the Scott and Ramona and Neil story of like my God, it was like my Scott Pilgrim's Precious Life or something like that. Basically the title of, once again, the comic, which also ended up being the title of the movie in this universe and stuff, like all that. Like, it was something of that nature. And yeah, she tried to give it to young Neil, but the movie didn't work out. So for her, it's like, yeah, things are probably even worse off because of this. But Scott's like, no, actually, I looked at that timeline and everything's fine, because we find out that's the reason why the robot was all over the place, because every time the robot popped out over the course of the series, that was because from the future, Scott's able to operate it. So he's watching everything unfold. Every time the robot was on screen, that was Scott controlling it, watching everything go down in the past. So he was able to catch up with the whole story, because he's like, oh, I don't need a recap. I was there experiencing everything kind of as you were. But he had brought it up to Ramona. It's like, yeah, you didn't give up on me. You're still there searching desperately to find me. And for Ramona, because she wanted there to be a reminder of like, yeah, what we went through, it mattered. Like, yeah, there might be hard times, but at the end of the day, old Scott, like, Scott, you're like the love of my life. And I just, just because things aren't in a good place, I don't want to erase that love. You are an important part of my life. You are someone that matters to me. I still love you, So, and I think, once again, I think that's an important thing of like, at the time you're going through such heartbreak, you don't want to remember anything, but it's like, no, it's all worth it in the end. Because it's like, and it depends on the relationship. Some stuff is so bad, you're like, that person's dead to me. I never want to think about them again. Like, that varies from person to person, because some people are like that. Other people are like, no, you're an important part of my life. And as long as we didn't end terribly, as long as we end it amicably enough, you are going to be a constant in my life. We can still at least stay friends, you know, in the cases where people stay friends with their exes. So, and in some of those cases, and, you know, even in smaller cases, like, hey, sometimes those exes get back together and stuff. So, which maybe, hey, that's what old Scott and future Ramona, which I even love. They're like, oh, age? Don't even ask. But, I also like the explanation of how the time travel works. Basically, this robot is retired, but it's like, right, as long as he can punch himself outside of space and time, basically he can kind of coexist all across time at once, and that's how to utilize time travel, because it's more like, hey, you use me as an anchor point all across time and kind of pinpoint where you want to go. They were kind of like loosey-goosey with it, being like, easy peasy, and just like, that's as much of an explanation you get, because after that they're just like, who cares? You know, that's all you kind of get for the explanation. So Scott ends up, you know, being brought back by Ramona, who, using her rollerblades, is able to, you know, because she built them based on parts from a DeLorean. When she goes 88 miles per hour, she's able to time travel, and she takes Scott back. And I even love both Ramonas taking pictures with each other. It's actually really cute. Like, both of them, like, one tries to do the bunny ears thing, and then the other one didn't do it. The other one does it, but this one doesn't. And then they both just kind of very, like blasé, just, like, stoic, you know, and then she like takes off afterwards, you know. So I'm like, are we not worried about the space-time continuum? There was a literal, once again, like loosey-goosey, because it also, you get into that territory where it's like, this isn't like a science fictional thing, this is a fantasy science fiction. There is a difference, because you could get loosey-goosey with some rules like that, because I'm like, you typically don't want to touch two objects that are basically the same thing from different points in time. You don't want them to touch, because that creates a paradox. Once again, that's a whole thing. But I'm, you know, because I'm basing that specifically on 12 Monkeys, specifically a TV show. I've never seen the movie. Either way. But yeah, Scott's been filled in on everything, and him and Knives kind of have their moment where it's like, right, I should have told you. I mean, the fact that he's like, I shouldn't have dated you in the first place. He's like, apparently, he's like, what was the exact word he used? I think he said apparently, he's like, apparently it's kind of frowned upon by society for a 23-year-old to date a 17-year-old. I love that he's like, I think he used the word apparently. It's like, once again, kind of not fully taking responsibility, but also being like, I shouldn't have dated you in the first place. Because of society frowning upon it. But also it's like, right, it just happened so fast, and I should have been honest with you. Which Knives is like, right, I'm thankful, and I'm glad that you're alive, but I'm also glad that I thought you were dead, because it allowed her to grow and experience so much. So it's like a win-win. So thanks in general, Scott, which I thought was sweet. And obviously Ramona wants to kind of get to, now whether it's like I've been waiting on it, so like I think that was about to be some sexy time stuff, but when they try to kiss, there's a barrier, which I'm like, so apparently there's some unfinished business, so there's no moving forward. Because Ramona was worried about the history, because I'm all over the place, sorry. I thought with where Scott's circumstances were in the future, I was like, are we going to find out Scott's part of the League of Evil Exes? I mean, he's tight with the twins and they make music, so he's pretty okay with them. I don't know where he stands with the rest of her exes. But also, like, Ramona did a lot of good, like, once again, whereas everything before was just like, now let's beat your exes, boom. It's like, there's a lot of recovery, and like, she's in a good place with a lot of her exes. There was a lot of closure in some capacity. So, but yeah, it's like the only way they're going to end this is if they're going to have to fight her exes, but it's like, right, like we'll have to track it down one at a time. But Knives is like, oh, but there's the Scott Pilgrim. Well, it's like if you can get them all together for a musical thing. I don't know if they changed the title to it, because it was supposed to be like the Scott Pilgrim's Little Precious musical, Little musical, whatever, but it changed to like all 7 exits. So I'm assuming that's supposed to be the new title for the musical now that like it came under Matthew's purview. But either way, they're gonna go duke it out. Everyone shows up, all the exes are there. And also Envy's there, come and saying like, oh, who's Todd? Yeah, Todd's dead to me. I don't know who that is. Todd, oh yeah, the no longer a vegan or whatever. It's like, yeah, you see him eating like some chicken. It's like, well, to be fair, I forgot. It's like he did eat poutine in episode 4. Yeah, episode 4. No, 5. he ate poutine, so it's like, right, we're already kind of past the vegan thing anyway. But yeah, they're showing up, like, everyone's gathered around. I even love Wallace being like, oh, they should have cast me as Scott. You know, I am the triple threat. It's just like, Jesus, Wallace. But it's like, you know, and Stacy being like, yeah, my brother. Oh, wait, Scott's alive? I guess I say my bro. He is, like, and kind of talks about him in present tense. Because I'm like, have you really been left out of the loop with all that? I mean, I guess while you were, like, eavesdropping, like, last episode on Julie and Gordon, you didn't hear that part. I mean, Julie and Ramona, because I had the reason why I was saying Gordon, because like Julie and Gordon showed up there together, so kind of a new power couple. Now, how this all plays out is going to be interesting. I'm sure it's going to be a repeat, but it's like, once again, like all the X's at once, what that's going to look like. Once again, you know, some idea of how the ending plays out, because once again, the movie has somewhat a similar ending, but also different. So how this all plays out with all the X's there, everyone's here gathered up for this moment. It's the grand finale, so it's definitely going to be interesting to see what the season finale has in store for us, how this all plays out. I'd assume, like I said, the movie is just kind of like the broad strokes of the comic. Like, obviously, there's a lot more explored and expanded upon in the comic, but I think generally speaking, like, because I was wondering, like, are there more adventures in the comics that just, like, beside just the X stuff, or is it all about the X stuff, but it's spread across the entire story, so you don't immediately go boss rush mode like the movie is like boss, 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 boss. Not exactly, but generally speaking, the movie was. So it feels like, I'm assuming the comic is like a lot more spread out, and like there are more misadventures in between, kind of like this. But to be fair, all these misadventures are tied to the X's in their own regards, almost like their own issues, like comic wise, or like their own story arcs. But either way, like I said, I'm excited to see what the season finale has in store for us, how this all plays out. But really, that's all I want to talk about. So the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and good